So what happened was that the vowel signs, which were created to represent the Tiberian pronunciation, they became fossils. As it were, what seems to have happened was that the authority of the ancient oral Tiberian reading tradition sort of was transferred to these vowel signs. So in other words, the authority of the oral tradition then became fossilized in these vowel signs, and they became the authoritative vehicle, as it were, of transmission of reading. But the problem was that nobody knew how to pronounce them after a while, because the actual original oral tradition of Tiberian pronunciation, which they were created to represent, had become forgotten. So Jewish communities began to read. They would write down their Bibles with Tiberian vowel signs, because they were if you like, they became part of the authoritative text. But they were reading the Bible with a different pronunciation. And one of certainly in Palestine and in most of the Jewish world in the Mediterranean and north and south, they pronounced Hebrew with what's known as the Palestinian pronunciation tradition. And so they were imposing this on their written Bibles. In other words, they wrote the Bibles with the Tiberian signs, but they actually read it with a completely different pronunciation tradition. Now, the Palestinian tradition was very widely used, popular tradition of pronouncing Hebrew in Palestine since late antiquity. And this, one of its features was that it had merged quite certainly in its vowel structure with its vowel system with the vernacular languages of Palestine, which include Palestinian Greek and Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. And this vowel system, which one of its distinctive features is the sort of the obliteration of distinction between Patach and Kometz on the one hand, Segel and Sera on the other, that all developed through the influence of Palestinian Greek and Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. But then that was the dominant pronunciation in Palestine, and then that got transmitted with Jewish migrations, even before the Middle Ages, almost certainly, but certainly during the Middle Ages, migrations of Jews to Europe, to various countries in the Mediterranean. And this is why the Jews in essentially most of those countries in the Mediterranean, the north and the south, their heritage is really this Palestinian pronunciation tradition. Now, in Ashkenaz, there were quite radical phonological changes, certainly after about the 14th century. There were all kinds of vowel shifts in the vernacular language of German.
Last week, I was at the European Association of Jewish Studies, and I heard a lecture where someone was quoting Eliezer Rokeach, Eliezer of Worms, which is in I believe it's northwestern Germany today, and he's spiritualizing the vowel sounds, and he says there are 6. He says vav kolot, 6 sounds, 5 vowels and shva, and he's writing at the beginning of the 13th century in northwestern Europe, and for him, there is no distinction between Patach and Kamatz, and there's no distinction between Tzere and Segol, right? So there's only 5 vowels plus Shva, which is amazing.
Yeah, you see, that reflects the fact that the Jews of Ashkenaz were heirs to this tradition of Palestinian pronunciation, which probably came through Italy, then the Rhinelands, and then moved further to the east. But then there was a shift somewhere post 14th century, due to the influence of sound shifts in the vernacular spoken by the Jews. That's sort of a Germanic language, Yiddish basically, but which is obviously Germanic essentially, which is a bit of a complicated story. But that's so. All I can say is that all the pronunciation, if you like, in the Western Jewry from west of Palestine is essentially inherited from Palestinian tradition, which is ultimately goes back to a form of Hebrew influenced by Jewish Palestinian, Aramaic, and Palestinian Greek. Now, the
the Palestinian pronunciation, or what we call Nikud Eretz Yisraeli, which has 5 vowels, you're saying that doesn't go back to Second Temple times the way that Babylonian pronunciation and Tiberian pronunciation does? Or does it?
No. The point is that, first of all, you've got to distinguish pronunciation from vocalization signs. But so what I call the popular tradition, which is the if you like, the popular in the sense of majority of people using it, it almost certainly does have quite early roots. It certainly you must go back to the periods of where Greek was still spoken, certainly, because it seems to have been influenced by Palestinian Greek, and so it's quite possible we're talking about a kind of pronunciation which was around in Second Temple period, and it was simply that it was the popular tradition. But the Tiberian tradition came out of it was the temple. Where it was the authoritative tradition, the temple. So we're not dealing with different chronological layers. We're dealing with different sort of social layers, if you like. So, but the point is that the prestigious authoritative oral Tiberian tradition lost its oral dimension, but it was fossilized in these vowel sounds we have today. And on that, it was imposed different pronunciation traditions.